Darnell Jones was a 17-year-old high school senior with a reputation for always lending a helping hand. Raised by his single mother, Latoya, in a modest apartment complex on the west side of town, Darnell learned early on the importance of kindness and respect. He took on responsibilities well beyond his years, helping care for his younger sister, Jasmine, while balancing his studies and a part-time job at the local grocery store. Despite their struggles, Latoya made sure her children understood the value of empathy, honesty, and integrity. The neighborhood they lived in was a patchwork of families from different backgrounds, all trying to make the best of their circumstances. Darnell was well liked in the community, often seen helping neighbors carry groceries, fixing broken bicycles, or mowing lawns. To him, these small acts of kindness were just part of being a good person. It was on one particularly hot summer afternoon that Darnell's life would take an unexpected turn. Mrs. Peterson, an elderly widow who lived a few streets over, had always seemed to keep to herself. She had moved into the neighborhood about a year ago after her husband passed away, and since then she hadn't made many friends. Most people saw her as grumpy, aloof, and somewhat suspicious of others, especially the neighborhood kids. Darnell, however, had always greeted her with a friendly smile whenever he saw her on his way to school or work, even if she rarely smiled back. That day, as he walked home from his shift at the grocery store, Darnell noticed Mrs. Peterson standing in her front yard, looking distressed. He could see the frustration on her face, and his curiosity was piqued. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Peterson," he called out, giving her a warm smile. "Everything okay?" "Oh, it's just this blasted TV," she huffed, waving her hand dismissively. "It stopped working again, and I've got no idea what's wrong with it." "Well, I know a bit about fixing things," Darnell offered, his interest genuinely piqued. "Would you like me to take a look?" Mrs. Peterson hesitated, eyeing him warily. "You? What would a young man like you know about fixing TVs?" Darnell chuckled. "I've tinkered with a few electronics before. If you want, I could try to help. No charge, of course." Mrs. Peterson softened, just a little, and reluctantly agreed. "All right then, come on in. But if you break it any more than it already is, you'll have to deal with me." As Darnell stepped into Mrs. Peterson's living room, he noticed the outdated, dusty television set. After a few minutes of examining the wires and fuses, he found the problem: an old cable that had come loose. With a little adjustment and some gentle coaxing, the TV flickered back to life. Mrs. Peterson watched with wide eyes as the picture returned, clearer than before. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, genuinely impressed. "You did it." "It wasn't much," Darnell said with a humble shrug. "Just needed a little fixing. I'm glad I could help." Mrs. Peterson stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether to say more. "Thank you, Darnell," she finally said, her tone softer than before. "It's rare to find someone willing to help without asking for anything in return these days." Darnell just smiled. "No problem at all, Mrs. Peterson. You have a good day now." He left her home feeling good about himself, unaware that this simple act of kindness would soon be twisted into something much darker. The next morning, as Darnell sat down for breakfast with his mother and Jasmine, there was a loud knock on the door. Latoya opened it to find Mrs. Peterson standing there with two police officers. Darnell's stomach dropped. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping forward. Mrs. Peterson pointed an accusatory finger at him, her face tight with anger. "You stole from me," she said, her voice trembling. "My wallet is missing, and you were the last person in my house." Darnell blinked, stunned. I I didn't take anything," he stammered. "I swear." The officers exchanged looks. "We need to search your home," one of them said, a hint of doubt creeping into his voice. Latoya stepped in front of her son. "You can't just accuse my boy without any proof. He's never been in trouble a day in his life." "We have a right to search if there's a report," the officer said calmly but firmly. "We're just doing our job, ma'am." Darnell watched in disbelief as the officers began rifling through their belongings. They opened drawers, checked under beds, and searched every corner. It felt like an eternity before they finally stopped, their faces showing no sign of finding anything. "Nothing here," the officer said, turning to Mrs. Peterson. "Are you sure you didn't misplace it, ma'am?" Mrs. Peterson looked uncertain for a moment, but then she glared at Darnell. "I know he took it," she insisted. "He must have hidden it somewhere." The officers left, but the damage was done. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon everyone was talking about how Darnell was suspected of theft. Some neighbors gave him strange looks, while others whispered behind his back. A few people, like Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, tried to defend him, insisting that Darnell would never do such a thing. But others weren't so kind. For the next few days, Darnell felt the weight of judgment pressing down on him. At school, his classmates asked uncomfortable questions, and even his teachers seemed to regard him with suspicion. He had always been known as the kind, helpful kid, but now his reputation was tarnished by an accusation he couldn't shake off. As the days passed, the tension at home became unbearable. "I'm so sorry, Darnell," his mother said one night, tears in her eyes. "You don't deserve this." "It's not your fault, Mom," Darnell replied, though his own voice was heavy with sadness. "I just don't understand why she would think I'd do something like that." Then, one afternoon, Jasmine came running into the house, clutching her phone. "Darnell, you need to see this." She handed him her phone, showing a video that had been posted on a local social media page. There, clear as day, was Reggie, an older teen with a reputation for causing trouble, laughing and showing off a wallet. "Man, you should have seen the old lady's face when she realized it was gone," he boasted, shaking the wallet. "Easiest score of my life." Darnell's heart pounded in his chest as he watched. "That's Mrs. Peterson's wallet," he whispered. "We need to show this to the police," Latoya said, already reaching for her phone. "This proves you didn't take it." At the police station, the officers listened as Darnell explained the situation and showed them the video. They nodded seriously, promising to investigate. It wasn't long before they tracked down Reggie, who, faced with the evidence, confessed to the theft. Darnell was finally exonerated, his name cleared. The next day, Mrs. Peterson showed up at their door again, but this time there were no police officers, just a frail, remorseful old woman. "I'm so sorry, Darnell," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I let my fears and assumptions get the better of me. I should have never accused you." Darnell looked at her for a long moment, his heart torn between anger and pity. "It's okay, Mrs. Peterson," he said quietly. "We all make mistakes." As word spread about what had happened, the neighborhood's attitude shifted. The same people who had once whispered about him now came to offer their apologies and support. They organized a small gathering in Darnell's honor, celebrating his kindness, resilience, and the way he handled the injustice he faced. And then came the most unexpected surprise of all. Mrs. Peterson, determined to make amends, announced that she had started the Darnell Jones Scholarship Fund to help kids like him pursue their dreams. She explained that she wanted to turn this experience into something positive, a testament to Darnell's character and the lessons she had learned about kindness, forgiveness, and the dangers of jumping to conclusions. As Darnell stood before his friends, family, and neighbors, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He had been through so much, but in the end, his integrity and kindness had not only proven his innocence, but had brought his community closer together. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, kindness and resilience could change the world. The hours after Darnell's name was cleared felt like a whirlwind. The moment the police confirmed that Reggie was the real thief, there was a sense of collective disbelief that rippled through the community. It wasn't just that they had wrongly accused Darnell, it was the harsh reality that they had allowed their assumptions and prejudices to overshadow the truth. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to reflect on the situation, and a transformation started to take place. Mrs. Peterson had been one of the most profoundly affected by the revelation. For days, she couldn't sleep, her thoughts circling around the gravity of what she had done. She had been so quick to judge Darnell, to cast doubt on his character simply because he was the last person she had seen before her wallet went missing. But it was more than that. Deep down, she realized that her assumptions were influenced by the fact that Darnell was a young black man. It was a painful truth to confront, but one that she knew she couldn't ignore. One morning, Mrs. Peterson gathered the courage to face the boy she had wronged. With trembling hands, she baked a batch of cookies, just like the ones she used to make for her own grandchildren. She carefully arranged them on a plate and walked to Darnell's apartment, her heart heavy with guilt and hope. LaToya answered the door, and for a moment, neither woman said a word. Then Mrs. Peterson, with tears welling in her eyes, spoke. "I need to see Darnell," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I owe him an apology." LaToya stepped aside and invited her in, though she couldn't hide the wariness in her eyes. Mrs. Peterson walked into the living room, where Darnell sat on the couch, flipping through a textbook. When he saw her, he sat up straight, his expression guarded but curious. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Peterson began, her voice cracking. "I was wrong. I let my fears, my ignorance, cloud my judgment. I should have never accused you without proof. I see that now, and I can't express how deeply ashamed I am." Darnell listened quietly, absorbing her words. The anger and hurt he had felt over the past week surged within him, but so did something else, a sense of compassion. He had seen Mrs. Peterson around the neighborhood before, always keeping to herself, always looking as if she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. It took courage for her to come here, and he could see the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you for apologizing," Darnell said slowly. "It means a lot. But more than that, I hope you understand why it hurts so much. You didn't just accuse me. You assumed the worst about me without knowing who I am." Mrs. Peterson nodded, wiping her eyes with a trembling hand. "I do understand," she said, "and I promise I will never let that happen again. Not to you, not to anyone. I want to be better. I have to be better." Over the next few days, Mrs. Peterson made an effort to reach out to Darnell's family and to the entire community, sharing her story and acknowledging her mistake. She stood before the neighborhood association one evening, speaking openly about the incident, the pain it had caused, and the lessons she had learned. It wasn't easy, and not everyone was quick to forgive, but her honesty and vulnerability began to change the way people saw her. Meanwhile, the news of Darnell's exoneration spread through the school and the local community like wildfire. His teachers, who had once looked at him with suspicion, now treated him with respect, even admiration. Classmates who had avoided him began to approach him with words of support. Some apologized for doubting him, while others simply wanted to be around him, drawn to his resilience and strength of character. But for Darnell, the most touching moment came when a group of his friends and neighbors organized a special gathering in his honor. It was held at the community center, a place that had always been a hub of activity, but had also seen its fair share of divisions over the years. As he walked into the hall that evening, Darnell was stunned to see how many people had shown up. The walls were adorned with handmade banners that read, "We stand with Darnell," and "Kindness changes everything." Tables were filled with homemade dishes, each one representing a different culture within the community. There was music, laughter, and a sense of unity that Darnell hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, he felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. At the center of it all stood Mrs. Peterson. As Darnell approached her, she held up a microphone, her eyes meeting his. "Darnell, she began, her voice echoing through the room. "I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can try to make it right, and I can make sure that others learn from my mistake. That's why I've started a scholarship fund in your name, the Darnell Jones Scholarship Fund. It's my way of saying thank you. Thank you for showing me what true kindness and integrity look like." The room erupted into applause, but Darnell was too stunned to react at first. He had never expected anything like this, and he certainly didn't see himself as a hero. But as he looked around, he realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone in that room, about the lessons they had all learned, and about the power of kindness to bring people together, even in the face of adversity. After the applause died down, people began sharing their own stories, moments when they had helped a neighbor or been helped in return, times when they had faced challenges and overcome them. It became clear that Darnell's story was just one thread in the tapestry of their shared experience, a reminder that despite their differences, they were all part of the same community. By the end of the night, as the gathering wound down, Darnell stood on the steps of the community center, looking out at the people who had come to support him. His heart swelled with a sense of pride and gratitude. Jasmine stood beside him, clutching his hand, and Latoya, with tears in her eyes, wrapped her arm around his shoulders. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You've shown everyone what it means to be a good person, and no one can ever take that away from you." Darnell looked up at the stars, feeling the cool night air on his face, and for the first time in days, he felt truly at peace. It wasn't just that his name had been cleared, it was that he had proven, to himself and to everyone else, that kindness, even in the face of injustice, had the power to change hearts and minds. As he stood there surrounded by his family and friends, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey had been hard, but it had made him stronger, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he was not alone. In the weeks that followed, the effects of Darnell's ordeal rippled through the community, leaving a mark that would change it forever. As news of the Darnell Jones Scholarship Fund spread, it became a topic of conversation not just in the neighborhood, but also throughout the city. People were intrigued by the story of a young man who, despite being wrongly accused, responded with grace, forgiveness, and resilience. What began as a small gesture from Mrs. Peterson soon grew into something much larger. The scholarship fund quickly gained momentum, drawing donations from local businesses, churches, and even individuals who had never met Darnell but were moved by his story. Within a month, it had grown into a substantial fund that could support several young people from the community in pursuing their dreams of higher education or vocational training. Mrs. Peterson, who had originally seeded the fund with her own savings, worked tirelessly to promote it, reaching out to other elders in the community and encouraging them to contribute. But it wasn't just about the money. The scholarship fund became a symbol of second chances, of the belief that one act of kindness could reverberate in ways no one could have predicted. It also became a platform for addressing broader issues that the community had long struggled with: prejudice, assumptions, and the way people often rush to judgment without understanding the full story. Darnell himself took on a role he never imagined. He became an unofficial spokesperson for the fund, speaking at schools, community centers, and even local radio stations about his experience. Each time he shared his story, he emphasized the importance of kindness and forgiveness. "We all make mistakes," he would say, "but it's how we respond to those mistakes that define us. We can choose to hold on to anger and resentment, or we can choose to forgive and move forward." One of the most powerful moments came when Darnell was invited to speak at a citywide youth conference. Standing in front of hundreds of teenagers from different neighborhoods, many of whom faced similar challenges, he felt nervous at first. But as he began to tell his story, he saw their eyes light up with recognition and empathy. They weren't just listening. They were seeing themselves in his words. "My mother always told me that kindness doesn't cost a thing," Darnell said, his voice steady and confident. "But what I've learned is that kindness isn't just about what we do for others. It's about how we treat ourselves when things go wrong, how we find the strength to keep going when life gets hard. And it's about having the courage to forgive, even when it's not easy." After his speech, countless young people came up to him, sharing their own stories of struggle, hope, and resilience. Many told him that his journey inspired them to keep pushing forward, to not let others' assumptions define who they were. For Darnell, this was the most rewarding part of the entire experience. In the weeks that followed, Darnell's life began to change in ways he could have never imagined. The scholarship fund that Mrs. Peterson had started in his name quickly gained traction. Word spread beyond their neighborhood, catching the attention of local businesses, community leaders, and even a few prominent figures in the city. Donations began pouring in, not just from people who knew Darnell personally, but from those who had heard his story and felt inspired by his resilience and kindness. Mrs. Peterson, now a tireless advocate for the fund, reached out to schools, churches, and community centers, encouraging them to get involved. She often spoke about how Darnell's actions had opened her eyes, challenging her own biases and misconceptions, and how she wanted the scholarship to be a symbol of hope and opportunity for other young people like him. Her sincerity and commitment moved many, and soon the Darnell Jones Scholarship Fund became one of the most talked about initiatives in the city. Darnell, however, remained humble despite all the attention. He continued with his daily routine, going to school, working his part-time job, and helping his mother around the house. He didn't feel like a hero or someone who deserved all the praise. For him, helping Mrs. Peterson with her TV had just been the right thing to do, and everything that happened afterward had been a whirlwind that he was still trying to process. But with every passing day, he began to see that his story was about more than just himself. It was about the impact one person's actions could have on an entire community. The fund had started with a modest goal of helping a handful of students afford college, but it quickly expanded. Within a month, enough money had been raised to provide scholarships to over 20 students, all from the neighborhood, who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford higher education. One of the first recipients was Darnell's friend, Marcus, a talented artist who had dreamed of attending an art school, but had resigned himself to giving up on that goal because of financial struggles. When Marcus received the scholarship, he broke down in tears, thanking Darnell for being the catalyst that made his dream possible. Darnell's teachers began to invite him to speak at school assemblies and events. They wanted him to share his story, not just about the false accusation, but about the power of kindness and standing up for what's right. At first, Darnell was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and he felt uncomfortable with all the attention. But as he stood in front of his peers for the first time, he realized that his words could make a difference. He spoke from the heart about the importance of empathy, about not judging others based on assumptions, and about the strength it takes to be kind, even when the world feels against you. "I was accused of something I didn't do," Darnell said, his voice steady despite the nervousness in his chest. "And for a moment, I thought the world had turned its back on me. But what I learned is that you have to keep being who you are, no matter what. Because in the end, it's your character, your kindness, that will speak for you. And it's that kindness that can change hearts." The impact of his words was profound. Students who had once avoided him or whispered behind his back now approached him with respect and admiration. Some even opened up about their own struggles, drawing strength from his story. Darnell became a role model, not just for his peers, but for people across the city who saw in him the embodiment of resilience and integrity. One Saturday morning, Darnell received a letter in the mail that left him speechless. It was from the mayor's office, inviting him to a special ceremony at City Hall. The letter explained that the city council wanted to recognize him for his contributions to the community and for being a shining example of how one person's kindness could spark positive change. Darnell's hands shook as he read it, unable to believe that his story had reached so far. When the day of the ceremony arrived, Darnell stood nervously on the steps of City Hall with his mother, Jasmine, and Mrs. Peterson by his side. A large crowd had gathered, and he could see familiar faces from his neighborhood, his school, and even his job at the grocery store. Reporters were there too, their cameras flashing as he stepped forward to accept a plaque from the mayor. Darnell Jones, the mayor said with a broad smile, is a young man who has reminded us all of the power of kindness and the impact one person can have on an entire community. It is with great pride that I present him with the City of Kindness Award, in recognition of his courage, his integrity, and his unwavering belief in the good of others. The crowd erupted into applause, and as Darnell stood there, holding the plaque, he felt a swell of emotion he could barely contain. He looked out at the sea of faces, some beaming with pride, others wiping away tears, and realized that this moment wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had believed in him, supported him, and stood by him when things seemed darkest. After the ceremony, Darnell found himself surrounded by people congratulating him. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door hugged him tightly, whispering, "You've made us all so proud, Darnell." His classmates lined up to take pictures with him, and his teachers, who had once been skeptical, shook his hand with genuine respect. Even Reggie, the boy who had stolen Mrs. Peterson's wallet, stood at the edge of the crowd, looking on with a mixture of awe and regret. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Darnell gave him a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that everyone deserved a chance to change. The weeks turned into months, and the scholarship fund continued to grow. Darnell started volunteering with a mentorship program, working with younger kids in the neighborhood who looked up to him. He taught them about electronics, showing them how to fix things just like he had fixed Mrs. Peterson's TV that fateful day. But more than that, he taught them about kindness, about standing up for what's right, and about never letting anyone else define who you are. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his mother and Jasmine, watching the sunset, LaToya turned to him with a proud smile. "You've done something amazing, Darnell," she said softly. "You've given this community hope. You've shown everyone that no matter where you come from, no matter what obstacles you face, you can make a difference." Darnell looked out at the neighborhood, at the lights twinkling in the windows, and felt a sense of peace. It hadn't been an easy journey, and there had been moments when he thought he might not make it through. But standing here now, surrounded by the people he loved, he knew that every step, every challenge, had been worth it. And as the stars began to appear in the sky, Darnell felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the recognition, the scholarship fund, or the awards, but for the chance to make a difference, to show that even in a world filled with misunderstanding and prejudice, kindness and resilience could light the way forward. He knew that this was just the beginning of his story, and he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge that one act of kindness could truly change the world.